That's great. I just realised actually this morning I didn't record it and someone had problems with audio, so I will hopefully share this with them later, the recording. So, so the first step is in translating your FIP information into kind of MSC PI scores is scoring your fishery using MSC PIs and the requirements. Now, the first thing to say is that at the moment, the MSC Fisheries Standard is, or the one being used on the FisheryProgress website is version 2. And to assist you in scoring, there is a MSC pre-assessment scoring tables template, which you are more than welcome to use to kind of help you keep track of everything. But essentially, you'll be assigning scoring categories to each performance indicator. And there are two approaches for this. And the first approach is by far the simplest, and that's when the fishery has already had an MSC pre-assessment. And the second approach is slightly, takes a little bit more work and a little bit longer, is when your fishery has had an alternative needs assessment but hasn't already been scored against the MSC Fisheries Standard. So we'll look at the first option, which is when your fishery already has an MSC pre-assessment. It's a pretty straightforward exercise. That pre-assessment will have already scored the fishery against the MSC Fishery Standard and the performance indicators. So you'll just have to take the scores from that original pre-assessment and upload to the website. Now it gets a little bit tricky because, as I mentioned, we're on version 2.0 of the standard, and I know that a lot of pre-assessments done basically prior to 2014 will have used version 1.3. So there will most likely be a need to rescore some PIs, and other PIs will drop out completely. The biggest change is in Principle 2, and it's a change from retained and bycatch species to primary and secondary, so it's how they're categorized. But we will discuss this more during the specific principle webinars, and my colleague Patricia is at the moment developing some guidance to help you convert your version 1.3 scores into version 2.0 scores. But essentially it's a fairly straightforward process. The second option is when the fishery that you're working with has had an alternative needs assessment, so it hasn't got any scores against the MSC performance indicators. So the approach here is to take the existing information that you have in your fishery evaluation, whatever that may be. It may be an IFO assessment or an assessment against IFO criteria, or the fish source profile on the SFP website. There are many different formats that your fishery evaluation may be. But the point here is to stress that you only have to use that existing information. As far as I'm aware, there's no requirement to go and collect new information for the purposes of uploading the scores or scoring the information that you already have. So for basic FIPs, the needs assessment may not cover the full scope of the MSC Fisheries Standard, and in that instance, some performance indicators won't be able to be scored. So I think there's an option in the website to apply an NA, not applicable, but then also you'll have to provide an explanation as to why that is the case, and it may be that you're just not addressing that PI as part of the improvement project. So yeah, you score the PIs for which information is available in your assessment. And for basic FIPs, I think you have to cover performance indicators across all three principles. So you need at least one PI to be scored for each principle. For comprehensive FIPS, however, every PI will need to be scored. This is going to require some knowledge of the MSC Fisheries Standard and the MSC scoring process. And I'm not entirely sure how familiar you guys are with either of those things. And that's why Patricia and I are here to help you kind of get your heads around the standard, to understand it, and to understand the scoring process. But also there are a lot of online resources, and we are developing some guidelines to help you. And also we're doing these training webinars. So it may seem like a daunting prospect and quite a lot of work, but we're here to help, and we have already, in the past published quite a lot of assistance documents. So it's not as daunting as it seems, I promise. So a quick introduction to the MSC assessment tree. So at the top you have your 3 principles, and they're in the blue boxes. In the orange boxes are your components. Within each principle, you don't really need to worry too much about those. The main thing for you is the performance indicators, which are in the green boxes. And there are 28 performance indicators across the 3 principles. And each performance indicator is further broken down into scoring issues. And it's the scoring issues that you assign your scores to, and then you combine those scoring issue scores to give you your overall PI score, which sounds complicated, but it's not, and I'm going to walk you through it in just a minute. But first, just a quick recap about, I've shown you the assessment tree, but just to kind of visualize what is assessed as part of the MSC Fisheries Standard. And it's Principle 1 looks at the stock, Principle 2 looks at the impact to your ecosystem, and that's just the impact of that specific fishery, so that specific fleet, whereas the Principle 1 covers the entire stock. Even if you only even if your fishery is only fishing on a small part of that stock, you need to take into consideration the health of the whole stock. And then Principle 3 is management of the whole area and management of the specific fishery. So back to the scoring. So I've mentioned scoring issues, and there's yet another term to add to the mix, I'm afraid, and that is scoring guideposts. So each performance indicator is broken down into 3 scoring guideposts, and these are just benchmark levels of performance, so SG60, SG80, SG100. And you can see those along the top, circled in red. And then we have the scoring issues, which are listed vertically. And each performance indicator will have 1 or more scoring issues. And it's against these which the fishery is assessed at the different scoring guidepost levels, so at the different benchmark levels. So how do you go about scoring with your scoring issues and your scoring guideposts? Well, you work down the columns of each scoring guidepost level. So you start at the 60 level, and you start with scoring issue A, and then you work down to B and C for this example. So does your fishery meet the requirements for scoring issue A at SG60? Same question, does it meet the scoring issue requirements, scoring issue B requirements at the SG60 level? And you keep going down. Once you've reached the bottom of all the, or the end of all the scoring issues, you then move along to the scoring guidepost 80 level. And you work your way down and then move across to the 100 level. And that's essentially it. If at any point you find that your fishery hasn't met one of the scoring guidepost levels at one of the scoring issues, that's where you stop. You don't have to continue further scoring above that. We'll go through some examples in a minute. So one thing to note is that for the website and also in MSC pre-assessments generally, we don't assign exact scores. It's scoring categories, so it's a likely scoring range, which makes the process simpler, but you still need to work through the scoring issues and the scoring guideposts, but you don't have to assign specific scores. It's more of a kind of like a tick box exercise. So yeah, it's a similar process. Work down the scoring guidepost columns, first considering if your scoring issues meet the SG60 level, then consider if they meet the SG80 level. You don't really need to check whether they meet the 100 because you're just interested whether your fishery is below the 60, between 60 and 79, or above 80. For the purposes of the website and for pre-assessment, you don't need to check whether the requirements are fulfilled at SG 100. You can if you want, but it's not necessary. So this is just reiterating, working down, and there are some scoring rules to help you come up with your overall performance indicator score, because at the moment you're just looking at how the scoring issues have been scored. So if one or more of your scoring issues does not meet the SG60, then your fishery will score less than 60 for the whole of that, for that performance indicator. So if all of your scoring issues meet SG60, then the performance indicator gets a score of between 60 and 79. If all of the scoring issues meet the SG80 level, then the performance indicator will score above 80 or equal to or above 80. However, if some scoring issues meet 60 and some meet 80, so you have some in the SG60 level and some at the SG80 level, then the performance indicator as a whole is scored 60 to 79. Now I know that's quite a lot to take in, and it's can be quite confusing, so I've got a few examples to kind of hopefully cement what I've just said and make it a bit more obvious. So here's the first example. We go down the SG60 level and we can see that this fishery meets all of the scoring issues at the SG60 level. So we move across to the SG80 level and we see that it meets scoring issue A at SG80, scoring issue B at SG80, but not for scoring issue C. So in this instance, the overall score for your performance indicator will be 60 to 79, because not all of SG80 has been, not all the scoring issues have achieved SG80. Another example, one of the scoring issues hasn't reached the SG60 requirements, but the other scoring issues have met the 60 and 80. The final score will be less than 60. So that is because there is one scoring issue that does not meet the minimum requirements. And then finally, one more example. All of the scoring issues meet the SG60 and the SG80. So it'll be greater than or equal to 80 will be the final score for your performance indicator. Now, before I move on, does anyone have any questions? Nope. Okay, excellent. I shall continue. As you, I should say, as you work through and do this in practice, it will make a lot more sense and won't seem as complicated as I'm making it. But sometimes these things are easier to do than they are to describe. So I mentioned earlier that the MSC has a pre-assessment scoring table template, which you are more than welcome to use to help you kind of keep track of where you are with your scoring. It looks something like this. Well, this is an example of it for one of the PIs. And it just allows you to score some information about the justification as to why you've assigned certain scoring categories, and it gives you a box at the bottom right-hand corner to record your likely scoring level, which is essentially your scoring category. Equally, there's a simplified scoring spreadsheet, which is shown here on the slide. A little bit simpler. You can still provide some information to remind yourself why you gave your scoring categories. Don't worry about the RBF column, that's not necessary. And alternatively, I know that the Fish Choice have put together a spreadsheet, which like a preparation spreadsheet for to fill in to help you upload your information, and I think it lists the scoring in a similar way to this. So to avoid duplication of effort, it might be best just to go straight to that spreadsheet and enter your scores in that spreadsheet, I think. The next stage is, once you've scored your fishery, is linking the existing work plan activities to the MSC Performance Indicators. And again, this is, I think, a relatively simple process. We do have an MSC action plan template, and once again, you're welcome to use that. I can't remember, Kristen, you might have to correct me, is that there's a requirement to upload the work plan, is that right?
Yes, that's a requirement.
Yeah. Okay, but it doesn't have to be in any particular format?
It doesn't. We don't require a particular format.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So you're more than welcome to use the action plan template that we have, but equally use what you already have. But there does need to be a link. You do need to link your activities or your tasks or your actions to the relevant PIs. And the way to do that is to basically ask yourself the question that if the completion of that activity or that task, will it lead to an improvement in the performance against that performance indicator? If the answer is yes, then you can link it to that PI. If it wouldn't have any bearing on the scoring or performance against that performance indicator, then there would be no link. I mean, and that essentially is what links. Can you predict or reasonably predict a change in score, or at least an improvement towards a change in score for that PI and the requirements under its scoring issues? Another thing to say is that one action may be relevant to more than one PI. There is a fair amount of cross-cutting across the standard, so it's quite possible, and in fact we see it quite often, that one action will, when completed, will contribute to improvement towards score changes. But of course, to know whether your activity will lead to a change means that you need to have some knowledge of the fishery certification requirements and what is required for each PI at the scoring guide levels. So again, we're here to help with that, and we have quite a lot of guidance and documentation to assist you with that process. So for basic FIPS, not all of the PIs will have been scored, depending on the amount of information that's available in the original needs assessment, but also depends on the objectives and the scope of that particular FIP. So actions and activities will only be able to be linked to the PIs that have been scored, or the PIs that relate to those specific objectives. Whereas for comprehensive FIPS, all of the PIs that score less than 80 will require actions to be linked to them. I can give you a very quick example. Well, just show you I don't know if this is going to work. Is this going to work? Just a quick look at the action plan template. Which is pretty self-explanatory and gives you an idea of, yeah, you list your activities. Down the left-hand side, you have your PIs listed along the top of the spreadsheet, and it's just a matter of trying to figure out which activity will be relevant to which PI. But again, I should reiterate, it's not necessary to use this template or this format, but it may be useful. It's entirely up to you. So when Patricia and I were translating some FIP information into MSC scoring and looking at linking PIs to activities, we came across a few issues. So I thought I'd just go through them very briefly now. You will notice as you go through the fishery certification requirements, so as you start looking at the PIs and the scoring issues, that the term unit of assessment, or UOA, is referred to time and time again, and it's essentially referring to the fishery that you are assessing. There is a definition, the MSC does have a definition, and that your fishery or your unit of assessment includes the following. So it's your target stock or stocks, it's your fishing method or gear types, vessel types and practices, and it's the fishing fleets or group of vessels or individual operators pursuing that stock. At this point in time, I wouldn't worry about other eligible fishes and unit of certification. It's really not necessary at the pre-assessment, kind of pre-certification point. That's kind of for a bit later down the road if you intend on certification. So essentially, it's target stock, method, and your fishing fleet, your vessels. And here's just a little visualization of that. So you've got your stock, you've got your method, you've got your location, and you've got your vessels, and that essentially is your unit of assessment. Oh, and I suppose related to this is a slide I showed previously about what is assessed. And so your principle 1 looks at the whole stock. Principle 2 just looks at the impact of your particular group of vessels and your particular gear types. And then your management goes broader again to the management of your stock, management of fisheries in that area, and then narrows back down to the management of your specific fishery. So we found that many fisheries that have been assessed have quite often used more than one gear type. And as I just mentioned previously, it's the gear type, or if you have more than one gear type, it does become important when you're looking at the impacts to the ecosystem. So when you're looking at principle 2, different gear types will have different impacts. So it's important to assess each gear type separately. But they can be included in the same pre-assessment, and they are included in the same pre-assessments that have already been done. Usually what we have found is that the scores are differentiated between gear types. So you'll have your scores for example, your habitat performance indicator. You'll have, you could have 2 or 3 different scores, and 2.4.1, which is your habitat outcome PI. if you've got 2 or 3 different gear types, you'll have 2 or 3 different scores. And in pre-assessments, they generally just leave it like that with these multiple scores for the same PI. But for the purposes of the FisheryProgress website, you can only input 1 score for each fishery, regardless of whether it has more than 1 fishing gear. So Patricia and I discussed this at quite some length, and our suggestion and recommendation, but this is of course open to discussion, is that to be precautionary, you should choose, you should go for the lowest scoring gear type. That's your overall score. So it's the highest risk, and you're being precautionary by picking that. When we come to looking at Principle 2, the specific webinar, we can kind of go into this in a little bit more detail. But we've tried to stick with the intent and the scope of the standard, and that means following this precautionary approach and going for that lowest score for that particular PI. The other issue we found was a lot of FIPs are multi-species fisheries, and they can and have been assessed as single units of assessment in single pre-assessments. With multi-species fisheries, and in fact any fishery, all species caught have to be scored, and they're either scored under Principle 1 or Principle 2. And we kind of picked up on a slight confusion about how do you categorize what your Principle 1 species are and what your Principle 2 species are if you have a multi-species fishery, and also if your endpoint is not MSC certification. Because at the moment the MSC define Principle 1 species essentially, and this is kind of simplifying it quite a lot, but essentially it's the species that will carry the logo, the MSC logo. So it's your certified product at the end of the day. Is this that product, that species is the Principle 1 species. However, we recognise that not all FIPs have the endpoint of MSC certification, so how do we translate Principle 1 species to that situation? And our interpretation is that for the purposes of the website and this whole exercise, that Principle 1 species will apply to those species against which improvement claims are being made. So it's those species which are of interest to the market. And then all other species will be assessed under Principle 2. And the reason we've come up with this distinction, or this interpretation for this distinction, is because there is a common misconception that the distinction between Principle 1 and Principle 2 species is based on target species and non-target or bycatch species. And that's not quite right. So if you think, if you're a multi-species fishery and all the species that are caught end up in, for example, fish meal product, and the claim is for that fish meal product or for that fishery as a whole, then it's all the species that are caught that end up in that product have to be looked at under Principle 1. But I've got a few scenarios that might help clarify that slightly. So the first one I've already just given as an example. You have a mixed species trawl fishery, the end product is fish meal, all of the catch is processed for the fish meal, and the improvement claim is for the fishery as a whole and for that fish meal product. So all your species would need to be scored under Principle 1. If you have a mixed species trawl fishery, the end product is fish meal, but the fishery also catches commercially important species which are excluded from the end product, and there's no improvement claim on these, then they would be scored under P2. But all the species caught and put into fish meal would be under P1. And then if you have a mixed species fishery where only 3 species will carry the logo, or 3 species are the species against which the claim is made, or your FIP is focused on those 3 species, then those 3 species will be assessed under P1 and all the others under P2. And so this is, I guess it's worth reiterating that this is our interpretation of how to help you guys apply the standard for the purposes of the website, whilst keeping within the intent and scope of the MSC's Fisheries Standard, because we do recognise that it's problematic for multi-species fisheries, and we are in the process of developing a mixed fisheries standard, but it's not going to come into it's being developed, and it's going to be at least a couple of years before that is officially published. So we're trying to kind of come up with an interim solution, and of course we're open to discussion about what that is and how we've interpreted it. But this is what we've come up with so far. We also recognise that listing all your species under P1 or P2 is quite problematic, especially if you have a trawl fishery that catches way over 100 species. It's going to be difficult because there probably won't be the catch composition information due to the large number of species. And especially in developing countries, quite often that information is very hard to come by. So we recognise that as an issue, but even so, we do have to remain within the scope and intent of the fishery standards, and at present it would require each species to be listed as scoring elements under the relevant PIs, so it would be the outcome PIs, the stock status PIs, and there are rules how to combine the scoring elements, so the different species scoring across PIs, which we can go into during the Principle 1 webinar. And then this is our other recommendation, and again this is up for discussion and clarification, but our recommendation is that if you don't have all the information about all the species that are caught, so you don't have catch composition, then especially if you're looking at Principle 1, it would score less than 60, and it would then be up to the FIP to define appropriate actions to address that lack of information, and especially kind of relating to stock status. So, I mean, the multi-species fishery aspect is probably the most complicated part of this whole process. So we will obviously provide more assistance when we're doing the other training webinars. Oh, and here we are at the end. That's